What's up, everyone? Thanks for tuning in to today's online jazz trombone lesson. Now, today's lesson is going to cover rhythm changes, and this is actually going to be part one of a several-part lesson grouping about this topic. This is a really foundational element that a lot of us are going to want to work on. It's great for getting our change playing together. It's just a key part of the jazz vernacular, and so I wanted to break this up into some sort of manageable sized chunks and also cover some areas that sort of different entry level of players might be interested in. You know, a beginner on rhythm changes might need to work or want to work on different things than a more seasoned player. And so hopefully these lessons will help you sort of like get some input wherever you are on that spectrum. Before we jump into things, just a little story time here. So when I was a younger jazz trombone player, and I had kind of gotten my blues playing together, and I at least started to sound reasonably confident playing a 12-bar blues and maybe other simple standards with a relatively limited set of chords, a lot of teachers and other players told me, Sean, you really got to get your rhythm changes together. And when I started to work on this, man, I just found it really, really difficult to improve on, especially when I compared that to some of the other tunes I was working on. I found that I didn't have the harmonic language together yet to really successfully navigate this tune. These tunes are often played fast, and I really didn't have that together at all. And, you know, as a trombone player, that's something we all have to work on. And then even once I did get some of that language together and felt a little more confident with the tempo, I still just don't feel like I ever really sounded authentic until a little bit later into my career when I sort of shifted my focus of how I thought about this tune. And that's hopefully some of the things we're going to talk about today. If you find some of this information helpful that we talk about today and you want a little bit more in-depth coverage and some practice advice on this, I encourage you to head on over to Patreon and check out the content that's available there. There are some great worksheets, some practice videos of me playing through a lot of this stuff in some different keys, different tempos, so we can really work through this together and hopefully help you improve on this tune and on lots of other stuff here that is available on the channel. So if this stuff that I offer you here is something you enjoy, I really encourage you to go check that out. Some really good material there. All right, let's get into it. So in part one here, we're going to talk about a few different concepts. And again, for my money, these are the things I actually probably should have started with when I worked on learning rhythm changes. I jumped right to like, man, I just got to learn all these 2/5s and try to just be able to bam, 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 hit every 2/5, indicate all the changes. But really, I probably should have started with something a little simpler, a little more melodic in nature. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. We're going to dig into how we use simple things like pentatonic scales and the blues scale to build solos over this form. We're going to talk about how we use voice leading and thirds and sevenths through the bridge in order to build ideas there. And then finally, we're going to talk about the importance of learning some melodies on this. There's a lot of different melodies for rhythm changes, and we want to make sure this isn't just something that we sort of know the changes and know like one or two melodies for. You want to know a variety of melodies. And not just the melodies, but also some of the other little peculiarities of the individual tunes. They're not all 100% the same. For example, oleo and anthropology might have slightly different changes that people play. Or for example, eternal triangle is another common rhythm change tune. It has a different bridge. So we'll talk about all these things a little later in the lesson. Okay, to set the stage, I'm going to play one chorus of B-flat rhythm changes at sort of a medium-ish tempo, a good practice tempo. And I'm really going to try to focus on some of these concepts that I just talked about, and then we'll break them down in the lesson and talk about how we can practice them. So there in that example, I really tried to limit myself to these concepts. Now, normally when I'm improvising and performing, I don't sort of stick myself in a box that much. I'm really listening to other musicians, thinking about what do I want to say in this solo, and that's going to guide my musical choices. But when we're practicing, it can be very helpful to sort of limit our options. So we really end up thinking about, did I make progress on this one or two things? All right, to start with, we're going to talk about how we deal with the pentatonic scale as it relates to rhythm changes. Many of you are probably already familiar with the pentatonic scale. We have both the major pentatonic and the minor pentatonic. We also have the blues scale in there, just a little bit of variation here. But let's just look at this in the key of B flat so we're talking on the same page. So this is a scale that's made up of the root, the second, the third, the fifth, the sixth, and then the root again. Now this is what we call the major pentatonic scale. The minor pentatonic scale has sort of a slightly different formula, very similar to the blues scale. We're mostly going to focus on this major pentatonic scale for this lesson. So let's check out what that sounds like. I'm going to play it across 2 octaves just as an example. One variation on the scale that's important to have under your fingers is what's called the major blues scale. Some people call this the Kansas City scale. The only thing we're doing is we're taking a flat third and sticking in there as well. So we have both a flat third and a natural third. And this scale can help us to really get in touch with some of the vocabulary and the language that's really, really common in jazz. And the scale itself, if we just play that, it still might just sound sort of scalish and not necessarily super melodic. So it's fine, you know, it's still a scale. These are important bits of music theory that we need to know and really have good mastery over. But at the end of the day, we don't want to just play scales in our solo. I think that's really the wrong way of looking at it. This is a tool that we use to build melodies and build ideas. Well, you might be saying, well, Sean, what are these ideas then? What are these melodies that come from the scale? Let's look at a couple of them. If you are somebody who has watched, other videos that I post, you've heard me talk a lot about vocabulary. Some people talk about learning licks. I really love to think about these as they're connected to language. I really view improvisation as very similar to language. And when we learn a language, we learn short phrases. We learn little words, and then eventually we learn to put them together. That is what these are. So let's just look at a few examples of some pentatonic vocabulary. Now, most of these employ a flat third and possibly a natural third or a major third as well. So these really connect with that quote unquote major blues scale, but they're not just scalar. They really just sound like nice melodies. So there's sort of an endless number of these. Let's maybe just take one apart with a little bit of detail, and then we'll hear a couple of them in context with the chords, with the play along. Let's look at the very first one that I played. Sounds like this. Now that's surely something you've probably heard a million jazz musicians play, and it's really not even very much of a scale. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 different notes. But that sort of area between the fifth up to the flat third, there is a lot of vocabulary in that area of this scale. And so really knowing how to manipulate it and build melodies here is the key. It's not just about running through the scale up and down and thinking that's going to get it there. It's all about knowing this language that's sort of the scale informs. All right, let's check this out with the play along. You'll hear me use 2 different pieces of vocabulary in this example. Now, this works great on the entire A section. Even though we're moving through a lot of chords relatively quickly, we can sort of think across all of those changes. If it's all in B flat, with some exceptions, you do still want to think about chord tones in key places. For example, when we go to the 5th bar, we have a B flat dominant 7th chord, or possibly a 2-5-1 to E flat, depending on how you're thinking about it. Suddenly, we have an A flat that is a really strong chord tone in that measure. That really kind of like sets up the 4 chord eventually resolving. So it's really nice if we get some ideas that have a flat there. And even though that is not in this particular scale. So it's all about learning how to manipulate these sort of things, learn the vocabulary, and then learning where to shift to kind of hit that next chord, all that type of good stuff. Now, these ideas don't just work well on the A sections. They work great on the bridge as well. You just have to move through each one of those key centers. So if we're on the bridge, we have sort of a D, a G, a C, and an F key center. Now, we're not even thinking about them as dominant chords. We're just thinking about them as major chords or even just major triads. This type of stuff works great. Let's check out a lick and see if we can move it through those couple of different key centers. First, I'll give it a try, and then we'll check it out with a play along. So I'm gonna use one of these that I just played. I might call this the Love You Madly lick. So Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn, they're credited with this tune, Love You Madly, which is a rhythm changes tune. And one of them that I played is a little quote from that tune. So in B flat, it sounds like this. So we want to be able to play that through our 4 keys for the bridge. So let's think about D first. Then to G. Then to C. Then finally to F. Now, let's hear what that would sound like with the play along. Because this lick does take up 2 measures, I'm actually going to only plug it in every 4 bars. So I'm going to plug it in on the D7 chord and on the C7 chord, just because it might be a little bit quick to plug it in on G and F. You certainly could, but when we're just trying to work on this, we might want to give ourselves a little more time to think, make sure we can land that idea. All right, great. So that is some information about how we can use pentatonic scales. They work really, really great in the A sections, can really help us sort of like think more melodically and break free from having to think change, 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 change. And then on the bridge, it can give us a way to navigate through these chord changes that, depending on how confident you are, might seem like less familiar keys to you. And again, a sort of melodic way that doesn't emphasize so much like, I gotta know all this music theory to make this happen, but we're really just thinking about moving melodies through these chords. Okay, moving on to concept number 2 for today's lesson, and that is how we deal with the bridge and how we deal with the harmony moving through the bridge. Now, there are a number of different bridges that do happen on rhythm changes. We're going to take the most basic one, where it is a 3-6-2-5. All of them dominant chords without any extra 2-5s or any other substitutions there. We're just going to start with the most basic. Now, because these are all dominant chords, we can really rely on our 3rds and 7ths to help give us voice leading through this. And really most chord progressions, 3rds and 7ths are where that voice leading comes from. Yeah, there could be a few exceptions, but really when we're talking about jazz, 3rds and 7ths are where it's at. Let's check this out and see what this actually looks like on the page. So if we just stack these chords up in root position, it's going to be a little bit obscured about what I'm really talking about here. We can see that it just looks like everything's jumping around. It doesn't necessarily look like there's clear voice leading here. What if we just boil it down to our 3rds and 7ths? That's really what we're talking about. That's where we know they are. Still, it just looks like things are jumping. Like I take the same shape, move it up, move it back down, move it up again. However, if I invert some of these, that is going to kind of get at where the voice leading really sits. So our D7, I'm going to leave my 3rd on the bottom, F sharp to C. My G7, rather than having it be like a G, B, D, F, so I have a B to an F, I'm going to take that F and put it on the bottom. And so then we can see my C moves down to a B natural, and my F sharp moves down to an F natural. And that's really the voice leading that's in the chord. And if you're working on your jazz piano chops, that's really how you voice these chords, is you look for those close movements so you don't have to jump around so much. And then the rest of that just continues through the rest of these changes. Our B flat and F move down, our B natural and F move down to a B flat and an E natural, and then they move down again to an A and an E flat. The descending nature of this voice leading allows us to build some nice ideas through the changes without necessarily having to move around too much, or we can kind of use that as something to grab onto while we're playing. Let's hear what it would sound like if I just used some rhythm and sort of use a descending line down to help me navigate through this bridge. So that is step number one. That's kind of our starting point, is that we can at least do that off of the third and then off of the seventh as well, depending on where we want to be in our range. Now from there, we've got to think about how can I make this a little bit more melodic, a little bit more something that, it's not that that sounds bad, but it's maybe a little one-dimensional in my taste. So let's see how we can add a little melody into this, but still make it all work. Okay, our first step is to be able to actually play some melodic content through this bridge and just transpose it into all the keys, similar to what we did when we were talking about pentatonic. So let's look at sort of our idea that we're going to use as a starter. Nice, simple, clear idea. It's just a major triad where I end up resolving to the 9 instead of to one of the primary chord tones. So our first step is just to move that through all of the keys with exact transpositions. Again, this is going to give us sort of this jumping around feel. Let's hear what that would sound like. Now, our idea starts on the third, and it, in this case, resolves to the 9. I don't know if I necessarily intentionally thought about it or just thinking about a nice little melodic chunk I could move through these changes, but I'm starting on the third. So that means the next chord, I want my idea to start on the 7th then of that chord, because again, we're thinking that they alternate so they get this descending line. So I'm going to move that to the G chord. And so then I'm going to start on an F natural. Now, I'm not going to keep that idea exactly the same. It's going to change a little bit just because the chord changes. And so to make sort of a musically satisfying idea, I'm just going to change a little bit. But my general shape is going to remain very, very similar. So let's see how that shakes out through the 8 bars of the bridge by doing this approach where I start with my motive, change it a little bit. Now, when I get to C7, I'm going to be able to go back to my motive exactly just in that new key because, again, I will be on the third. Cool, that's starting to sound pretty good. And I was pretty rigid there. I really was just moving this idea through these different keys. If I was actually playing it in a solo, maybe I'd be a little freer with rhythm, or I might feel a little more freed up to sort of like change it as I went. Maybe change the rhythm, change the note selection, particularly maybe on the second time through, particularly when I got to that F7 chord. Let's see what this would sound like if I kind of, put all this stuff together in a little bit more, I would say, idiomatic type of fashion to something more like I might actually play when I'm soloing. Now, this maybe gets a little beyond what we're talking about today because there are definitely more moving eighth notes here and that type of stuff. And I really probably play some things that you could be like, these are 2 5 licks. But what I'm really thinking about is just that, in this case, 3rd to 7, 3rd to 7 resolution. Even though there's a bunch of other stuff going on, that is sort of the core of what's making my ideas flow. Let's just take a quick look at what's going on with that short example. So again, I started my F sharp, very, very sort of similar idea as I did to begin with, where I have sort of this like triadic shape of an F sharp, a D, and an A, and then maybe a 9 in there as well. And then I move that through a little bit of interpretation of that idea, and then I resolve on my flat 7 on my G chord. Now here, I'm just playing some straight up bebop basically, and I was really trying to think about how can I connect this idea to my next third. Now, I actually ended up going down an octave because that's just where my ear was taking me, but I was still really thinking, how can I make it to the next third of the chord? And so then I'm on my C. I actually kept my idea from my D7 chord, exactly the same in this case. And then on F7, I played something a little different, but I did start on the 7th. So again, I get my 3rd to 7th, third to seventh resolution. Even as our ideas become more complicated, these sort of things are what really tie our playing together and give it some integrity and make it sound like it's grounded. So we're not just sort of like throwing things out there and hoping some of it works. We really have like solid, both theoretical and ear foundations there that connect these ideas with what's really going on with the harmony. Okay, we've made it to our last concept for today, and that is the importance of learning melodies on rhythm changes. From my perspective, you just want to make sure you are not the person who sort of only knows Olio. Now, Olio is a good tune. Olio is an important tune that you know. It's a very commonly called rhythm change head on gigs, at jam sessions, all that type of stuff. But it's important that we know more than that. Not only do we want to have a broader sense of like what tunes we can play, but also these are great learning tools to becoming better players. If you were to learn 4 rhythm changes tunes, I would learn Olio, rhythming, anthropology, and cottontail. These are sort of like different types of rhythm changes tune. Olio is kind of like a riffish tune. Rhythming is sort of a through composed melody that is not super bebop oriented. You know, it doesn't have a ton of like fast moving eighth note lines or that type of stuff, even though we would think of Monk as a bebop player. It doesn't have some of the same complexities as anthropology does, for example. So these are really different tunes, even though they're actually kind of written by similar era musicians. And then finally, cottontail is sort of different than all 3 of these. It's more of like a swing tune. A lot of times, I think it shows up in A flat in real books, which I'm not really sure the recording they're referencing. I'm sure it's one that I'm not aware of. But Duke Ellington plays it in B flat. And so I would really encourage you to learn this tune in B flat or learn it in both keys. All 4 of these are B flat rhythm changes. That is the most common key that people play it in, and for better or for worse, that's where we want to start working on this. Now, as I said, it's not important just to know these just so you can like go play some gigs or go play at a jam session. These are great tunes, and a lot of times the actual like melodies of the tune have some of the hippest things in them. For example, anthropology is basically like learning a Charlie Parker or Dizzy Gillespie solo. I mean, it just has all of the trademarks of good bebop playing in it. So you can really kind of think about this like I'm enhancing my solo playing by knowing these melodies really well. Let's look at a couple of these, and what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to use them as, again, sort of an idea starter in my solo. We might call these quotes, and they certainly would be, and there's a place to practice that type of stuff as well. But here we're really looking about them as idea starters. So we're going to use cottontail, and we're going to use anthropology as our idea starters for this example. Cool, so it's just another avenue to go to get stuff happening in this sort of tune that doesn't require you having like a million 2-5-1s under your fingers that you can just sort of like cut and paste, cut and paste, cut and paste, or a bunch of like hip substitution stuff that you have together on the bridge or wherever. It's, again, a very melodic approach, and an approach that if you are somebody who feels like, I don't have rhythm changes together so much, I would really recommend you start here or some of these other things that we talked about in today's lesson. All right, that's it for today. I hope that gets you started on rhythm changes, or if you're somebody who's a more experienced rhythm change player, I hope that that gets you to think about some of these concepts maybe in a fresh way. As I mentioned, I was somebody who really, I think, had the cart before the horse on this sort of tune, where I really worked a ton on trying to work on the harmony and get 2-5s happening so I could really play those fast-moving bebop lines. But it really wasn't until I learned how to sort of like play the blues a little bit, play some of these more like melodic ideas on this tune, that I think my soloing sounded more complete. It always just sounded like I was sort of trying to pass a test as an improviser and, you know, prove that I knew these 2-5-1s and prove that I knew the changes, really, rather than I was making music that was sort of informed by the entirety of the jazz tradition. All right, we will see you in the woodshed.